We have an old friend in the house with us today, Dr. Derek Yonai. So happy to have him with us today. He's the director of the Center for Free Enterprise and an associate professor of economics in the Barney Barnett School of Business and Free Enterprise at Florida Southern College. He's also a senior research fellow at the Institute for Faith, Work, and Economics. Now, as the director of the center, he is responsible for developing and supervising Florida Southern's new free enterprise education program. So he has quite an opportunity and a challenge that's been presented to him. Now, you might also recognize his name because he has received a number of awards, including the Spirit of Inquiry Award from the John William Pope Center for Higher Education Policy. So he is someone who has been in our area. He actually followed our own Dr. Roy Cordato into the economics seat over at Campbell University. So a lot of connections here, and we're delighted to bring him back today. Today, Dr. Yonai is going to be talking about business education, which he says has produced 4 decades of business school graduates who know how to do business but don't understand the inherent social nature of business. Further, he says, by failing to train the minds of business leaders by only training their hands, business leaders have actually forgotten that business is about people and human flourishing. We are really looking forward to this presentation today. Please welcome Dr. Derek Yonai.
Well, thank you for that gracious introduction. So I'm going to talk to you about the need for free enterprise and business ed, and let me begin by saying it's great to be back in North Carolina. I left 18 months ago, and it's wonderful to be back, especially here at the Locke Foundation. I'm going to give you a quick roadmap of where we're going to go, just in case I lose some of you, which hopefully I won't. We're going to talk about first, why we need to talk about free enterprise when it comes to business curricula. 2, the inherent connection between free enterprise and human flourishing. And finally, what can you do to help spread the news about free enterprise and human freedom and liberty, tying back to human prosperity? So the first thing we need to do before we talk about why we need free enterprise and business ed is talk about what the problem is. When I say business education or business person here, most people in this crowd are going to think entrepreneur, job creator, somebody who creates win-win opportunities, somebody who enhances the lives of people around them. But the real question is not what do you think about business, what does the average American think about business? And how does the average American perceive business? So the Media Research Center has been studying the way business people have been portrayed in the media for quite a while. And in 1981, what they found on TV was half of the corporate chiefs committed illegal acts. 45% of all business acts on TV were illegal, and only 3% of business people did anything productive. This is the complete opposite of what we think of when we think of a business person. Usually when I give this talk to a bunch of CEOs, they're sitting there going, we're not staying open if we're only productive 3% of the time. Because that means 97% of the time we're doing nothing other than maybe committing illegal acts that other half. Now, you might say, well, that was 1981. We had Reagan for a year, just kind of struggling through Carter. Surely things have gotten better after 8 years of Reagan, 4 years of Bush, and 8 years of Clinton. And in 2005, not so much. Of the 16 films that were nominated for the top 30 Academy Awards, half of those movies illustrated business people committing crimes. And only one major character out of 70 was actually shown being productive and ethical while doing business. Again, business people are still getting a bum rap by popular media. In 2006, if reality was based on television, you would be 21 times more likely to be killed or kidnapped by a business person than by a member of the mafia. So RTP would be a really dangerous place for you, right? This is the problem. More likely to be killed or kidnapped by Donald Trump, but Trump has his own problems right now, as opposed to, say, Tony Soprano. This is absurd. If the world worked this way, We wouldn't have our cars, we wouldn't have food, we wouldn't have the equipment that's filming this. We wouldn't have any of these things because we'd be too busy cheating, lying, and stealing from each other. So what happened? How is it you have a culture where we train business people and yet popular media portrays them as crooks? And you don't hear the popular business folks complaining about it. They just go, I guess that's just the way things are. So how do we get there? How do we get to a world where even business people don't stand up and go, hey, you're wrong? It's because of the state of business education. Now, to be perfectly fair, I had never set foot into a business school until I interviewed for my first job, which was at Campbell. I'm an economist. I'm also a lawyer. So you can hate me for two reasons. But as an economist, I spent most of my time in a school of social sciences. I study people. I study how people interact and get along with each other or don't get along with each other. I mean, even coming out of grad school, my pecking order of job placements would be like law professor, which probably not so good now, economist in a social science department, maybe legal studies, and then maybe economist in a B school because they pay better. But I had never thought about business as business going through graduate school because, again, I'm an economist. What that has done for me is it's given me the ability to be free and observe business education as an outsider looking in. It means I haven't been tainted by drinking the Kool-Aid. I can come in and ask the critical questions. Why are you doing that? How does that make sense? What's wrong with you guys? So the big problem we have with business education is the fact that it's very good at training hands. If you think about most business education, it's essentially very expensive vocational training. It's about, here's a nail, here's a hammer, there you go. Do that 15 more times, and if you can pass a test, we'll give you a grade. That's the problem. It's about training hands. It's about how do I put together a profit and loss statement? How do I put together a business plan? How do I go about balancing my books? How do I increase my profit margin by playing with Excel? That's what business education has turned into. How do I market the product better? It's about, again, doing. It's not about thinking. And ultimately, this is where the problem lies. If you have generation upon generation upon generation of doers, you're not going to have anybody who really understands how and why they're doing what they're doing. Now, having been at two schools, one that had ACB-SP accreditation and one with AACSB accreditation, a lot of acronyms, you would think, well, accrediting bodies should solve this problem. No. The problem with accrediting bodies is the fact that you have to keep metrics. You have to close the loop, if you will. You have to show that you actually taught the students what you set out to teach them. The problem is, it's a whole lot easier to measure proficiency when you teach skills than it is to teach and measure proficiency of thinking. So all this does is create a race to the bottom. As more and more schools compete for more and more warm bodies, you're going to have more and more schools competing to become accredited. And the accrediting standards are going to be what can you objectively measure and what can you demonstrate to us as actually meeting your teaching learning outcomes. Again, it's going to create that race to the bottom as you want more people in your classes, as more people try to become accredited. You're going to lose those courageous schools that are going to stand back and go, you know what? Maybe being accredited isn't worth it because we think ideas matter. And because ideas matter, it makes it harder for us to assess what our students are doing. It creates a Greshams Law problem. So for those of you econ folks, this is sort of like inside econ code. Greshams Law is the notion that as you flood more and more bad currency into the market, people are going to pull the good currency out and hoard it. Well, basically, this is a twisted version of Greshams Law. As more and more people want to become accredited, you're going to be driving more and more of the soul out of business education as it becomes increasingly more technical and increasingly more vocational as opposed to holistic and well-rounded. Part of the problem, and the way I explain it when I used to talk to prospective parents is kind of like this. Back in the early days of the automobile, you had to learn not only how to drive the car, but you also had to learn how to fix it. Because more often than not, it was going to break down, something mechanical was going to go wrong, and there wasn't AAA. We were lucky if we had roads. So as an operator of a vehicle, you had to know not only how to use it, but also how it worked. Now think about your car today. Unless you're an engineer or you're an auto enthusiast, most people have no idea how an internal combustion engine works. You just wait for the little light to come on and you're hoping the light's right. I mean, it's gotten even worse to the point that we don't even have to know how to parallel park. And we're moving to driverless cars where we don't even have to know how to drive anymore. We just have to know how to sit. So what happens then, right? What happens if that vehicle, that car, isn't just an automobile, but it's your economy? And you're sort of motoring down the highway, smoke starts spewing out the back, you pull over. Well, here's the problem. You can't just pop the hood, call AAA, and wait for a tow, because there's no tow. Nobody knows how this stuff works. That's the problem. We don't train business people to understand the inner workings, if you will, what happens inside the black box called business. We train people to pull the lever called business and wait for goodies to come out. We don't teach them what happens behind the scenes. What we don't do is we don't teach them how business is inherently social. And if you think about it, this, I think, is the biggest criticism of business education. The vast majority of people who argue for free enterprise are typically economists or philosophers. You know, business isn't even in either of those. And yet we're the ones. I'm the person who never set foot in a business school, and I've directed 2 free enterprise programs because business just doesn't know how to deal with it. So the solution is, I think, fairly simple. We have to train their hands. I'm not saying we don't. You still have to be proficient. You still have to be competent. But we also have to train their minds. We have to provide that foundation for understanding and appreciating the system that underlies everything that they do. We have to have our students understand business is inherently about other human beings. That's a weird concept in a business school. They usually go, it's about profit. If you're, depending what kind of economist you are, you're like, yeah, it's about profit maximization, max profit. Sort of like its cousin, Max U. Problem is, much like Deidre McCloskey would argue, Max U's kind of a soulless, heartless person you wouldn't want to befriend. Max profit, well, that's a jerk we see in TV. We have to get beyond just the equation and the Excel spreadsheet and get back to what is business inherently about? How do you make profit? How do you achieve this wonderful interaction where somebody gives up something they worked hard for what it is you're providing? I mean, ultimately, that's what a transaction is. You're giving up something you busted your butt to earn for something. Unless they put a gun to your head, you're just not freely giving it away. I know I'm not freely giving it away. I'm waiting and expecting a good or service in return. I'm waiting for somebody to improve my life before I hand over my cash. But that's what we forgot. Business is inherently social. It's about other people. It's always about meeting other people's needs, whether it's provider, customer, social interaction, or employer-employee, social interaction. Business is inherently about the connection between 2 or more other human beings. And that simple truth is something we tend to forget. And what we need to do is produce more holistic, more well-rounded, if you will, business leaders. So back in 1975, 40 years ago, the Lundy Chair at Campbell University was founded, which is a position that I held and Roy Cordato held before me. The Lundy Chair holds a special place in my heart, having been there for so long, because I would never have thought about it this way until I heard how this thing came to be. So this is basically oral tradition, so it's storytelling time. As was conveyed to me by Dr. Wiggins, I'm going to convey to you. So in the early 70s, they were out at the beach, Burroughs T. Lundy, Norman Adrian Wiggins, businessman, college president. We're sitting around commiserating about the horrors of business education, how awful it had become. That even as late as the 70s, business education had become all about numbers and math and quantitative skills, and it wasn't about thinking or philosophy. And Burroughs T. Lundy told Norman Adrian Wiggins, you know what? How about this? I'm a business person, and I care about free enterprise, and I care about the health and future of North Carolina. Let's invest. Let's teach business people about the why, the social aspect of business. And they created the Lundy Chair of the Philosophy of Business, so that business students could understand not just how to do business, but what's the philosophy of business? What does freedom mean for business folks? What does individuality mean? What does dignity mean? What does using God-given skills and talents mean? What does it mean to create a win-win relationship? All those non-quantifiable outcomes. They decided they needed to create a course called The Philosophy of Business that, at least at Campbell, every business student since 1975 to today has to take if they want to graduate with a business degree. Because their idea was that it matters, it's important. We can't just have a bunch of business users out there. What we need are business leaders. We need people who understand how all those pieces fit together. And that's exactly what I do at the Center for Free Enterprise at Florida Southern College, is I essentially carry on that Lundy Chair mission in terms of teaching our students that business is inherently social. The way I word it in our mission statement is that the Center for Free Enterprise at Florida Southern College reconnects business education back to human flourishing. It reconnects business education back to social activity and interpersonal relationships, and the fact that freedom matters, our institutions matter, the rule of law matters. So we have places in this country, we have Campbell, Florida Southern, there's a lot of other great schools that have a free enterprise chair or free enterprise programs where we are teaching business students that there's more to business than just the numbers, the model, the cool technique that everybody's learning now that nobody will use 5 years from now when they create a new bubble, that ideas, in fact, matter. What I always told parents and what I always tell my students is I want them to walk away with something more than what they came in the room with. And I think there's a really great quote that encapsulates what it is I want my students to get. And it's from the naturalist Edwin Wade Teal. It is morally as bad not to care whether a thing is true or not, so long as it makes you feel good, as it is not to care how it is you got your money, so long as you got it. What Teal is arguing for is this notion that being ignorant is morally indefensible. Just because you feel good about it isn't good enough. You have to understand, why does it work? What is the truth? How do things function? Or the way I would explain it to parents is, I want my students to not only be able to earn money, I want them to understand how and why they got it, so that they remember the core first principle thing: improve the lives of others. If you don't make money. That it's about interacting with other people. So when I say free enterprise, what do you think about, right? This is one of those, different people have different definitions, tomato, tomato. I like to think of it as a Venn diagram. We need an ecosystem for human flourishing. We need a right environment. During the 80s, we basically had people out there talking about free markets and free markets and free markets, and I've had somebody call me a Freemanite, and I tried not to be too offended by it. It takes more than just having free markets. Even Adam Smith understood that, which people totally gloss over. Adam Smith understood you have to have these other institutions in place in order for voluntary trade to work. So the way I break it down is, yes, you need free markets, but you also need the rule of law. You need those rules that apply to everybody equally and that we all acquiesce to and voluntarily agree to play by. And then you need that impartial referee, which typically we call government. It's only where you have those three things overlap: a competitive market, the rule of law, and good governance acting as an impartial referee, that you have free enterprise. It's like sports. A good sporting event, especially if it's between two teams or two individuals, you have to have competition. People have to compete, try to win. You need the rule of law. You have to know what the rules of the sporting event happen to be. And you typically want that impartial referee or umpire. You don't want the game rigged. If you remember, call back several years ago, there was that basketball referee who was betting on basketball and was blowing calls so he could actually win his bets. People were angry because those games are rigged. Likewise, people should be angry now when government picks winners and losers in terms of who gets a subsidy and who doesn't. Likewise, in order for free enterprise to exist, we need all those three things. But here's the hard part. If you look at the picture, free enterprise exists in a tiny little wedge. Small little overlap. This is why it's so delicate. This is why you can easily lose it. This is also why a lot of places haven't had it. It's delicate. You can't have two, you need all three in order for that to exist. And again, that's what free enterprise is about. It's about the institutional underpinnings of what enables business people to function in an ecosystem where we generate win-win outcomes, as opposed to a cronyist system where you generate win-lose outcomes. The way I explain it to my students when I used to teach philosophy of business is through a pyramid structure. Business education's up here at the top. This is what it means when you learn how to do business. But the way you do business is founded upon what kind of economic system you have. And unfortunately, in many business schools, the econ professors don't do a very good job of communicating that nexus between economics as a spontaneous order of generating, coordinated behavior and business. Usually economics is taught as numbers, graphs, calculate comparative advantage. It's not taught as a way of thinking. It's taught, again, as a applied science. But that economic system is founded upon what kind of government do you have? But then again, what kind of government you have depends on what kind of philosophy you hold. This is the problem. At best, the bottom two parts of that foundation are missing in most business education programs. Probably most likely, depending on who's teaching economics, all three are missing. And you're being taught business in a void, acontextually, without any way of sort of anchoring it to anything real. And that's the problem. You have to understand, what is your philosophy? Are human beings nothing more than trained animals, in which case training monkeys is business education? It seems perfectly fine. Or are people free individuals with dignity who have God-given talents, who are able to create win-win opportunities? Very different ways of looking at what is a human being. But what is a human being defines what kind of government you have. Will it be a fairly liberal government in terms of classical liberal, where you have rights and freedoms? Or is it going to be an oppressive government, which defines what kind of economic system you have? Is it going to be more market-based? Or is it going to be more centralized planning, which then leads to business? Do you end up with business schools, or just people learning out of political science schools because everything's determined by the government? That's what we're missing, the bottom part of this larger pyramid. So I'm pretty passionate about it. I guess the question is, why does this matter? Maybe I'm just idiosyncratic. Maybe I'm just like a crazy nut job who thinks ideas are cool, but ideas actually have consequences. Economists like to measure lots of things. I've said that before. And one of the things we try to measure is free enterprise. How well or how functioning of a free enterprise system do nations have? And we look at that through something called economic freedom, the Economic Freedom of the World Index. And what we have found is that economic freedom and free enterprise, they are the driving force behind the creation of entrepreneurial opportunities, job creation, and human flourishing. Unleashing entrepreneurship, unleashing people's creativity in a system that respects them, dignifies them, and allows them to use their talents appropriately. That's what pulls all of us up out of poverty. And our data suggests that those ideas are typically true. So for example, if you're looking at per capita income, average income, you make 9 times more in the most economically free countries than in the least. 9 times more. You experience 3.5 times more economic growth in the most economically free countries than in the least economically free. Now, people might be sitting there going, oh, great, you're an economist. All you care about are rich people. Because, see, you talked about income being higher and economic growth being there. We knew you didn't have a heart, jerk economist. No. No, don't get me wrong, there are a lot of jerk economists out there. But if we think about economists qua economist, as economist, what was it that Adam Smith was looking into? He was looking into the causes into the wealth of nations. He wanted to know why some nations were rich. More importantly, why some nations were poor. How do you alleviate poverty? As an economist, what I care about is how do we create coordination to alleviate poverty, to improve the standard of living for all people. So if we look at it from that perspective, the income of the poorest 10% is 10 times greater in those places with the most economic freedom than those places with the least. 10 times greater. If I were in the lowest 10%, I would want to live here. I think you would too. Absolute poverty, this is living on $1.25 a day. Only 2.7% of the people in the most economically free countries live in absolute poverty. But compare that to 41.5% in the least economically free countries. You don't have to be some sort of like Scrooge McDuck loving money to like economic freedom. You can be the person who goes, I want to help the poor. You should like economic freedom too. Because it's the engine behind releasing, if you will, pent-up capital, human talent, and unleashing it so that we can all be better off. If we look at life expectancy, on average, you live 20 years longer in the places with more economic freedom than in the least. Now, this group, you get 20 years. 20 years is meaningful to you. I teach college students, I teach undergraduates. 20 years, it's like how long I've been alive. And the problem is because they're 20, they think they're invincible. Right? That's why they do half the things they do, probably. So the way I explain it to them is, this is what 20 years means. You get to know your grandparents. And immediately, like, whoa, what? You got to know your grandparents. And think about just what that simple phrase does in terms of the passage of knowledge in a society. Knowing your grandparents means that more human knowledge, tacit knowledge, experiential knowledge gets passed from generation to generation because you're alive to pass it on down. You're alive to pass it on down to your grandchildren in case your kids mess it up. It's opposed to being dead. 20 years is huge, and that's the difference. We live 20 years longer. We have better access to health care because we have freer markets, which enable people to, again, earn higher levels of income, be able to go and use their talents if they're in the medical profession, to go out and improve other people's health. Life satisfaction is higher in places with more economic freedom than in places with the least. And literacy is higher in the places with the most economic freedom than with the least. Both male and female literacy. So I minored in English Lit as an undergraduate. If you care about people being able to read and write, economic freedom is a great solution to that because it gives you an incentive to learn how to read or write because there's a payoff for it. There's a payoff on that investment. Now, if we look at economic freedom as a whole, what we see is that it also leads and is associated with greater levels of employment, less corruption, more civil rights, cleaner environments, and lower infant mortality rates. There's nothing on here that should be censored or banned or people are going to start tweeting about as being hateful. Who doesn't like these things? Who doesn't want to have higher levels of income, less poverty, more people gainfully employed, doing what it is they were, if you will, called to do? Who doesn't want a cleaner environment or more civil rights or fewer dead babies? Right? You'd almost have to be inhuman to not want any of that. And that's the point. It's not a left or right thing. It's not a political issue. It's about, do you understand how the world works? Do you understand, using the philosophy of economics and looking at the data we have, how human beings flourish? I would argue that even my friends on the left, we all love these things. If you're a human being who's not a mass murderer, you love these things. Here's the point of conflict. We always argue over how to achieve it, right? When we get into arguments with people who don't agree with us, it's never, and it should never be about wanting to improve somebody else's life. It's usually about the means. But here's the problem, guys. According to the data, we have the method to alleviate poverty. We have the way to improve other people's lives. What we need to do is share that. Not get caught up in sort of these, red herring arguments about, oh, I like people more than you do. No, we all like people. We're just more effective at it. Right? That's really what it comes down to, effectiveness. It's not about who has a bigger heart, who bleeds more. It's about who's just darn right effective. And that's why I always tell my friends on the left, we agree. We just disagree on the means. And we can talk about that. So where are we today, as in the US? Well, here's the Economic Freedom Index of the world for 2014. And the United States is right there. We are 12th in the world in economic freedom. Now, if 12 scares you, I should have given this talk last year or the year before because we were like 17th. We've actually moved up. So I guess kudos to us. But we're still out of the top 10. To put this in some perspective, and this is why, again, I said it's not a left or right thing. It's not a political issue. It's a knowledge issue. All the gains we made in economic freedom between 1980 and 2000. So let's think about history, which is scary because I have undergrads who were born in the 90s. but between 80 and 2000. You had Republicans and Democrats. You had Bush, you had Reagan, you had Clinton. And under both Republicans and Democrats, we had gains in our economic freedom score. It was Bill Clinton who said, the era of big government is dead. How quickly we forgot that. So it's not a political issue. However, all of those gains in economic freedom we made between 1980 and 2000 under both parties, we have lost all of that over the last decade under both parties. Republicans and Democrats have both effectively destroyed our economic freedom that we spent 20 years building. That's why I tell people it's not a political issue. It's an economic literacy issue. Do we actually understand what we're arguing about? Or are we just arguing because it gets us airtime on TV? Are we really here to help people? Or are we just here to sort of be nice, fancy, shiny, and be sort of that next bright object for the next 5 seconds in the limelight? It's not political. Democrats and Republicans got it right for 20 years. Democrats and Republicans got it wrong over the last 10. And we fell down to 12th. To put this in perspective, in 2000, we were ranked second in the world in economic freedom, right behind Hong Kong. We lost so far. We went down to 17 a couple years ago. We're back up to 12. This is how far we have drifted away from some of these principles. So the question is, why did we fall? What happened? Well, we didn't follow the principles of free enterprise. Sort of surprise. We overspent, we overregulated, and we engaged in cronyism. So what do I mean by we overspent? We ate our future. We spent money we didn't have. We are spending money that our children or our children's children are going to have to pay back. In 2008, might have been 2009, there was a faculty symposium at Campbell about the financial bailouts. And I'm the free enterprise guy, so people were ready to vilify me going in there. And the first thing I said was, well, thank you. And then I said, what about the children? And immediately everybody looked at me and goes, huh? So what about the children? What right do you have to steal from your child? What right do you have to steal from your grandchildren? To bail you out of the mistakes you made? What about the children? That's what happens when you overspend. There's no giving tree where you just say, I want more. Here you go. Right? This is literally intertemporal, intergenerational theft. But we don't look at it like that. We just look at, oh, we're just borrowing against the future. And they'll pay for it. Overregulation. We've made it harder to do business. The Small Business Administration estimates that it costs about $10,500 just in compliance per employee. Just to be legal, it costs about $10,500. Think about all the jobs you can create with $10,500 per employee. Think about how much better you can offer your services, how much cheaper you can offer your services if you weren't paying all of that. Again, we're putting in places speed bumps to economic recovery and economic growth. And cronyism. This is where you go and ask for a subsidy or a bailout, or you go and lobby politicians to give you some special privilege you otherwise nobody would deserve. What it does is it diverts resources from productive uses to unproductive ones. So where I live in Florida, Amazon ended up getting a huge subsidy to build a warehouse facility. We're giving tax breaks to Sam's Club, basically Walmart, to open up a new store down there. What that does is it diverts resources from Sam's Club or Walmart and Amazon to, instead of doing better what they do, to go and look for places that are willing to give away goodies. On top of that, think about it from this perspective. Like if you're in Lakeland, Florida, and you've been creating jobs for years, why does the new guy get the break? Where's the love for the guy who's been here? How are you picking winners or losers? How is this just not entirely arbitrary? Right? It's like that phrase, everything you learned when you were 5 is everything you ever needed to know. That's not fair. Why is he getting the whole cake? Just because I like him better. Right? There's no real economic argument for it. And then the biggest thing that hit our rule of law score, nationally at least, was our decrease in property rights security. So not only is 2015 the 40th anniversary of the Lundy chair, it's also the 10th anniversary of the Kelo decision. That's what correlates with one of our huge falls in economic freedom in the US was the Kelo decision. Because as Justice O'Connor would have put it, well, there's really nothing to stop them from replacing a Motel 6 with a Ritz-Carlton or any farm with a shopping mall. That's where we live. So what about North Carolina? Place I called home for 10.5 years. Well, as if economists didn't have enough stuff to measure, there's something else called the Economic Freedom of North America Index, because we just like measuring stuff. And North Carolina is ranked 13th with Missouri. Now, why does that matter? And I know the John Locke Foundation has the First in Freedom rankings, which incorporates some of this data. Well, the reason it matters is because your neighbor to the north, Virginia, is ranked 3rd, and your neighbor 2 states over, Georgia, is ranked 10th. If you're competing with Virginia and Georgia for businesses and jobs, where would you go? Someplace where it's easier to do business, or someplace where it's going to be a little bit harder to do business? Where would you rather open up shop? A place that's going to regulate you and you end up being less productive than you otherwise could be, or someplace that sort of moves people out of your way and lets you do what you're supposed to be doing? That's part of the problem. So what it means for North Carolina is there's a lot of room for improvement, which is a good thing, because it means that there's a lot of good that can happen here. If we look at the economic freedom ranking of North Carolina, and you've got to think of this invertedly, I didn't want to have a negative ranking up there. Back in 2006, North Carolina was ranked 9th in the United States. It then shot up to 12th, got back down to like 7th, then shot up to 13th, 15th, 14th, and currently 13th in the nation. So we're trending in the right direction. Our economic freedom ranking's climbing. But it also means that we still have some work to do. For example, if we look between the years 2005 and 2011, so basically the difference between the 2008 Economic Freedom Report and the 2014 Economic Freedom Report, North Carolina increased its spending by approximately $15.3 billion. That's a lot of extra spending. One of the ways you can increase economic freedom is to cut spending. For those of you who think numbers are scary, here's a bar graph. Climb, 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 climb. Oh, it's going down, which is good. It's going in the right direction. But if you want a scarier graph, I'm just going to borrow one from this John Locke Foundation. Total government spending, going back to the 70s. Now, if that was economic growth, that's a great trend line. Unfortunately, that's growth in government spending. This is one of the things that we need to get under control if you want to have better economic freedom and increased prosperity in North Carolina. Another thing you can do, which I know the Locke Foundation talks a lot about, is removing barriers to entry, reducing licensing requirements, making it easier for people to go out and get a job, having somebody who's licensed in another state come here and be able to start work immediately, as opposed to going through some sort of medieval obstacle course. A 0.5 increase in the economic freedom score. I know right now that has like zero context for you. If North Carolina can get back to the economic freedom score she had in 2006, that would be half a point increase in economic freedom. That would correlate to about an increase of per capita GDP of almost $6,500. That means by increasing your economic freedom by half a point, statistically you should see about a $6,500 increase in per capita income. Anybody here too good for $6,500 extra dollars? I'm a faculty member. I'm not. So when it comes to economic freedom and free enterprise, we have to ask ourselves a couple questions. First, on average, are people better off? And so far the answer has been, sure, definitely, yes. How do our poor rank relative to the average person on Earth? My students are like, whoa, you got that, you screwed that up, right? No, I really meant that. How do our poor rank to X bar person on Earth? And more importantly, how do we get the average person on Earth up to our level of poverty? That really hurts their brain. So average income on planet Earth, depending on how you measure it, is about $8,000 to $10,000. The poverty line for a single individual in the United States is $11,170. That means we have people who are defined as impoverished by the federal government who actually earn more money than the average human being on this rock called Earth. Our free enterprise system, this mechanism that has allowed us to escape poverty, has done so much that we define poverty as being better than the average Joe on Earth. And yet, how many people out there actually appreciate any of that? Right? You really notice, I like to watch TV. You really notice it when you go and watch The Amazing Race and the people from the US end up in some impoverished country, because they typically have these huge emotional breakdowns in the back of these taxi cabs. They just start bawling, oh my God, I've never seen so much poverty. This is how people live. What part of you're lucky don't you understand? What part of we got it right is so important. And that's what we have to share with people, is how to get it right. How do we give them the power to pull themselves up and achieve what we've achieved? Or are we too busy forgetting and having that senior moment of how we got here and letting it go by the wayside? So how much does it take to be a top 1% wage earner on planet Earth? So what I usually do is I'll ask my students, how much do you plan to make when you get out of college? And they usually go like, oh, $35,000, $36,000, whatever. According to CNN, which is not Fox News, by the way, obviously, this is a couple years old, but according to CNN, if you make $34,000, you're in the top 1% of wage earners in the world. And the power of that is just incredible to me, because I teach college classes where most of our graduates will be in the top 1% of wage earners. And then I think to myself, if they never had the opportunity to learn about business and philosophy, how many of them could actually appreciate that? Or like in my hometown, Los Angeles, I'm a native Angelino. $15 minimum wage. I did the math on this. It comes out to about $33,500 or so, which puts people who make minimum wage in LA in the top 3% of wage earners in the world. Again, this is what happens when you lose context. We are lucky. Doesn't mean we're always going to be lucky. If you kill the golden goose because you're not paying attention, it's not going to resurrect itself. So the concern is this. As our economic freedom falls, will our prosperity fall with it? And what we need to do is we need to educate people, business leaders, business students, about the power of economic freedom, free enterprise, if you will, and its connection to human flourishing if we want to have a better tomorrow. Or in one simple line, which is why I think all of you are here, ideas matter. Ideas matter a lot. So what can you do? Support places like JLF, support the Locke Foundation. For those of you business folks, you can go out there and form these things called Bastiat societies. These are wonderful little groups where business people who are interested in these ideas but really haven't fleshed them out get together and begin to have these exchanges. They bring in speakers and they talk about what does it take to have a functioning free enterprise system? What does it take to have economic freedom? And they're doing it because they're interested. So business people can create a subculture of informing each other about economic freedom and informing each other about the role they play in our society. You can engage in political dialogue if that's your thing. It's not mine, but if it's yours, have at it. Or, which is my thing, you can support colleges and universities that actually teach what I call holistic business education, the free enterprise system. So if you want more information, you can go to freetheworld.com and get a copy of the Economic Freedom Annual Report or the Economic Freedom of North America. You can go to www.economicfreedom.org, or if you like, you can go to the Center for Free Enterprise's Facebook page, facebook.com/CFE at FSC. As a shameless plug for what we're doing in September, we are hosting an intercollegiate seminar, weekend seminar from Friday to Sunday, and we're going to be covering the first 2 volumes of Hayek's Law, Liberty, and Legislation. And it's free. We will cover travel expenses up to $700, and if you know somebody who can benefit from this, our deadline's today, but if they reference the fact that they heard about it through one of you or through the JLF, I'll be willing to extend that deadline for them. So for people who are interested. Again, it's open to undergraduates, completely free. We will cover travel up to $700, and we'll provide you all the materials. So at this time, I'll take questions, comments, and concerns.
Derek, I think there's a piece that you're missing in your assessment of what's going on in business schools, because it's not nature abhors a vacuum. And what I've seen in my experience with business schools now for many, many years is that it's worse than being a sterile environment. The left has moved in very heavily. And in business school after business school, especially in management departments, and that's filtered up, the whole sort of really Marxist social responsibility paradigm of Ralph Nader and others have sort of infiltrated business schools, and that is the philosophical guide, not free enterprise. not capitalism at all, but really socialism, dominates business school. It's a very anti-business environment. So it's just by way of saying, look, it's more than just there being a vacuum there of ideas. No, they're the wrong ideas dominating at least major business schools. You know, places like where you are, Florida Southern, Campbell, I'm not so sure anymore, but the big schools, the Harvards, and most of the business schools in the Northeast are horrible. They're totally leftist and totally controlled by the left.
Roy, you're right when you say nature abhors a vacuum. The problem was that vacuum was created. Unfortunately, people like you and me, we didn't fill it. As you said, people from the left did. And that's where not only did we have a vacuum that we have to overcome, we lost our ground. We lost our footing. Now we're fighting an uphill battle. So, you know, you're right. They came in, filled the void that was left there because nobody else was explaining it, and now we're left with the sort of unenviable task of trying to bring balance to it.
A couple of questions. I'm thinking back to your, when you have the law, and then you mentioned politics doesn't play into it. 2 points. Alec was here a couple of weeks ago, and I think of the top 22 states that have the best economies, I think every one of them was run by Republicans and conservatives. And to go against this tidal wave of what's going on in universities, somehow they got to galvanize their success and show, yes, this is what works. And secondly, aside from the schools, the state legislators, especially in all the states, should get an education on the benefits of going this direction, because they can't help themselves. They want to regulate. They want all this crap. And somehow they have to be resold what got them elected in the first place.
Right. I mean, you've got this huge problem where, as you were saying, according to Alec, it looks like the Republicans are leading the charge. The problem is if you message it that way, you've immediately alienated half of the demographic. So that's why for me it's not about sort of the political ideology or even the party affiliation. It's about what were the ideas.
I mean, you sell the recipe, not so much the party.
Right. The problem is you want to separate the recipe from the party in order to be able to get that broader outreach, so you end up with more dialogue as opposed with people shouting at each other. So that's the way I go about it, is even with my liberal colleagues, I don't talk about political ideology, I don't talk about party affiliation, it's about what are some strategies we have. Let's talk about the mechanics of it. Let's deal with the nuts and bolts and get away from sort of the shiny, flashy object that sort of distracts us every once in a while.
If you had some measurement for success of a business person, if you have any data that indicates that a business person who takes the curriculum that you advocate will achieve more often business success than one who focuses exclusively on the how to run a good business and does not include the curriculum that you are advocating.
Well, I guess one way to look at that would be sort of broadly speaking. Look at the startup companies like Solyndra that went after government subsidies and government incentives that eventually went belly up, as opposed to companies that actually went out and tried to create real value. So on one hand, you can see who's been trained to just play the game, and they usually don't last very long. Places that create honest, value-to-value, win-win relationships typically last a lot longer. So I'm thinking of people like Bob Luddy, who started out at the garage, a small machine shop, and has built up captive air systems. You know, he's working really well. We have a lot of people who support these different free enterprise programs at different schools throughout the country. So for example, John Schnatter, Papa John, endowed a free enterprise program, I believe it was at the University of Louisville. Again, they're trying to create value by providing a service for other people. You're not seeing cronies out there starting up these programs because they don't have the money to spend because they're in it, again, short-term gain, bail out. Not literally.
Last question.
Yep.
Yes.
In your ranking of different countries by their free enterprise scores, I noticed some of the countries above the U.S. have nationalized healthcare systems, which normally you'd associate with driving your free enterprise score down. Is that just an effect of other parts of their governments compensating for that? Or now that we're sort of going towards the dark side, we're all kind of averaging out?
It comes down to the way we measure economic freedom. So we're looking at not just whether or not there's nationalized healthcare, but you're looking at how much is the government spending, How secure is their monetary system? So are they inflating out of control, or are they running a fairly well-behaved, strict monetary growth policy? What does their access to international trade look like, and what do regulations look like, as well as the protection of private property rights? So there's a lot of other variables in there. So for example, Canada is ranked #1 in the Western Hemisphere. But one of the things Canada has done that we haven't done is they've cut government spending from basically the mid-90s on. It was actually interesting. A person from the Fraser Foundation was giving this talk a couple years ago, and he put up on the board government spending in Canada, and it was going like this. So I guess for you, it'd be like going down, as opposed to government spending in the United States, which is going up. We looked a lot like, right now, Canada in the 80s. Canada now looked a lot like us during the 80s. We kind of had this role reversal. So there's a lot of other factors that are at play other than just the nationalized healthcare issue.
Professor Derek Yonai, thank you so much.
Thank you.